Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchangified. So, quizzes are part 1, deadline February 1st, exam 1 quizzes part 2, March 1st, exam 2 quizzes part 3, April 5th, exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, April 26th, and these are all end of day, 11 to 9 p.m. Exam 5, the final, covering all the themes. Deadline's on Thursday, May 2nd at noon. Again, all the stuff's up there on Blackboard, and you can always complete stuff before the deadlines, but be sure to do so, because once the deadline comes, that's the deadline. For the paper, draft deadline is April 4th. You can do as many drafts as you wish, and I'll put detailed comments on them, a hypothetical score, and that way you can decide if you want to keep doing drafts or just upload the paper and be done with it. If it's uploaded by April 9th on Blackboard, you can be sure it's in a Word or PDF format so it can be read. By then it'll be +5 to your paper score. If you need another week, April 16th, the emergency deadline for full credit, and then of course the desperation deadline on April 26th for the half credit. Before pressing on to new stuff, anything about the old stuff, or the stuff to be that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we're looking at the argument by analogy. And as we saw, we use analogies in a variety of ways, such as explanatory analogies, saying one thing is like another to help people understand. We use rhetorical analogies to say one thing or person is like another to make it seem good or bad. And of course, there are also metaphorical analogies that compare things for their artistic feelings. But our focus is on the argument by analogy. And we saw the structure is this, and the basic idea is that you say because two things are like in certain ways, they're alike in this other way we're concerned with. Now, the question then is, how do you tell when you've got a good analogy or a bad one or an ugly one? Well, since arguments by analogy are inductive, they are not tested by like truth tables or diagrams and proofs. They're tested by standards. So you take the standards, you apply them, and you judge whether it is strong or weak. So without ado, here are the standards. In the recursion. First, the number of properties x and y, the two things to be compared, have in common. The more they have in common, the stronger the analogy. Now, unfortunately, there's not like an exact formula here. There's not like a S equals, number of properties x plus number of properties y, etc. It's just the more they have in common, the better the argument. Now, merely having stuff in common is not enough. I mean, it is a factor. More in common, the better. There's also the question of the relevance of how relevant the qualities, the properties are for the quality you're concerned with. So, the third standard is whether there are relevant dissimilarities. Now, this can all be smushed down to one sort of mega standard, which is this. The more alike the two things are in relevant ways, the stronger the argument. The less they're alike or the more they're not alike in relevant ways, the weaker the argument. And so essentially there are 3 points of battle. One is, do they have enough stuff in common? Yes or no. Are the qualities actually relevant to what you're talking about? Yes or no. And are there relevant dissimilarities that break the analogy? And so we're essentially weighing the similarities to the property you're concerned with. So it would be, we'll run through like 2 examples of how to test the strength of an argument by analogy. Now last time I used an argument by analogy involving the Monopoly game. And I said, well, suppose we have a variation of Monopoly where whatever is won in the first game, you put it in like a pile, the next game you roll randomly, and one player gets all that stuff to start the game. And we would say, of course, that would be a Monopoly you wouldn't want to play because it'd be really unfair. Because whoever won the winnings from the last game is going to win. So therefore, you can make the conclusion that having that sort of large-scale inheritance in life would be unfair. It would make the competition, in the United States unfair. Then the question would be is, is that a good analogy? And so you'd raise the question of, do they have enough in common? Are the properties relevant? And are there differences that break the analogy? So let's try to break that analogy. How is life not like Monopoly? Well, no one would play that game. Yeah, it's a game. Although life is also a game. Literally. The game of life. For real. And who Googles that? So what are some things that would break the analogy? I mean, one thing, of course, yeah, it's a game, and we expect games to be fair. You know, when we're playing like baseball, you know, we don't let one team start off with like 100 points. So, yeah, we expect our games to be fair. So you could say, well, we don't expect life to be fair, so there's an important difference. Only games should be fair, life should be unfair. Also, one thing people wanted in Monopoly, how much stuff is there you can have in the game? Is it like yeah, you have one board. And so people have argued that, you know, people who inherit start with more stuff, but we can create new things, like we can create like a Facebook or a Google. But then, of course, you could change the analogy. You could say, well, you could make Monopoly where you add another board. Like, because there's many versions of Monopoly. You just take a board, attach to another board, you just keep adding boards. And even then, people would say, no, I'm not going to play that. Now, of course, there are other differences as well, because in the example, only one person gets the stuff, and in life, you know, many people like inherit, and also, like in life, you're not always competing against people who are, you know, I'm not competing against the Trumps, I'm not, or the Hiltons, or, you know, Bezos, although we kind of are. So you could say that's a different, we're playing multiple games. Yeah, so you could say that the analogy does break down. It's not a perfect analogy. And that's how you kind of fight over an analogy. You know, are there things that break the comparison? Another example, Donald Trump came up with a great one. I can't help but use it, because it's a good example of an argument by analogy. Anybody know his analogy he likes with his wall? His wall is like wheels. Yeah, because people people were critical. They said the wall is old technology. People figured out how to build walls. Yeah, and he said that, you know, wall is medieval, wheels are medieval. Technically, neither of these is true, because they're both predate medieval. Wheels are good, or they work, therefore walls work. Now he did lay out, when he was doing it, he was laying out a formal argument by analogy. Clearly he's been watching my videos. Thanks, Mr. President. Yeah, so, you know, the wall is medieval or old, wheels are medieval or old, wheels work. And he looked at all the cars and said, all these cars, even the really expensive ones, they work. Therefore, walls they also work. They're good. And so it's an argument by analogy, with all the parts in all the right places. It's well done. But then the question is that a good analogy? Well, walls and wheels, do they have stuff in common? Yeah, they are technology. You know, they are old. Walls go way. People figure out like how to pile dirt. Even hands build walls to pile dirt. And the wheel is pretty old. Probably not as old as the wall, because the wall is just like pile up some dirt. The wheel is like stuff. And are wheels good? Do they work? Yeah, well, wheels work really well. So they do have a fair number of properties in common. Then the question is, are there relevant differences between the two? Between walls and wheels? Are they enough alike? Well, true, they're both tech, but then you look at it and say, well, wheels are pretty clearly useful. You can give all the reasons, because you know you need them for vehicles much more efficient than having like not wheels, like skids or something. But their similarities are pretty limited. You know, they're both technology, they're both old, but you wouldn't infer therefore that they're like good. Yeah, so it doesn't seem that there's enough relevance to. You wouldn't go, well, they're like in two ways, so it's good. And there are a lot of relevant dissimilarities, because there's a lot of ways to bypass walls, whereas wheels are quite useful. So I'd probably say that's a pretty weak analogy. You wouldn't go, gosh, you're right. We got to build this wall because wheels and walls are old, so they're both great. So when it's building an argument by analogy, you'd want to take into account those factors. Now, of course, you can use these for, obviously, our main point is for philosophical argumentation. So the way you build these into a philosophical argument is, again, have something that people already accept as being true or plausible, and make a comparison to that. For example, I'll give an example of argument by analogy for epistemology. Now, one of the problems that we're looking at, or we'll be looking at, is the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is this: how do you know that what is happening today will happen tomorrow? Or what you've observed will be borne out in the future. And the problem of induction is that leap. Now, Hume raised the question of, we believe that, for example, the sun will rise tomorrow, that fire will still burn tomorrow, but we can't prove that. We can't go from fires always burn to it will burn. So one question would be is, well, how could you make an argument to make that seem plausible? Well, one way to do it is by analogy. You could say, imagine, by analogy, that we were characters in a video game, but we didn't know. So we're all in a video game, and we're in a software world, and somebody's off doing cool stuff, and we're just the NPCs. Now, what could happen, of course, in a video game is they do patches and changes. So we may find out tomorrow that one thing that worked really well, or something we all used, suddenly stops working. Because if you ever play video games, they do patch them. So if you have something that's really unbalanced, either like really terrible or super good, they'll go and change that. Or if they have like some glitch, like things get stuck or something, then they go and redo it. So we could wake up tomorrow and find that our video game had been patched or altered or new rule set. And from our standpoint, it would seem like the world is totally different because it would be. So by analogy, you could argue maybe our real world is like that. There could be like tomorrow some change or patch that it's always worked this way before, but world 7.5, that doesn't work anymore, or there's some new feature. So by analogy, you could argue, just like in video games, you have these patches and changes. So if you were a character in a video game, it would seem like the rules had changed because they had changed. You have no way of knowing that the world could work in a similar way. Things could just change, and tomorrow will be different, and you wouldn't be able to predict that because you don't get to read the upcoming patch notes. And so by analogy, if it could happen in a video game, it could happen here. And that'd be an argument by analogy. Now, of course, you'd want to assess it like, do they have enough in common, etc. And one main difference would be, well, video games are programmed and created, but you could argue that if you believe in God, God is like the programmer and the creator. So you could say, well, that's not working out too well, or you could already have a patch history planned. In 2019, this will change. Small things or big things. Okay, before moving along, anything about the analogical argument or wheels that needs any more stuff? Wheels are very useful. Interestingly, some societies did not discover the wheel. The Aztecs apparently did not have the wheel, which is a disadvantage. Gotta have wheels. Next one is the argument from or by example. Now, this, of course, is arguing by giving examples, shockingly enough. Now, in normal everyday life, people will typically do this informally. They won't use like the formal form where they'll say, premise 1, example 1 supports claim P. Example 2 supports claim P. Example 3 supports claim P, therefore claim P is true. They'll just make their conclusion, give examples, or give examples and make their conclusion. So, for example, outside of philosophy, take, we got the 2020 elections coming up. Seems just like yesterday we had an election. Oh, yeah, And what we'll see, of course, is campaign ads. And one thing that politicians will be doing is making various claims in their ads about why we should accept it. Now, one thing that we used to kind of want in our president would be things like foreign policy experience. And so one thing that the people running will try to do is say they have foreign policy experience. And what they'll do is give examples. They'll try to list the things that they have done. Or that they're competent leaders. And they'll try to give examples of their competence. Now, of course, you can also do these the opposite way. When people are running critical ads against their opponents, they'll try to say their opponent has bad judgment and give examples of that. Or their opponent is, incompetent, and give examples of that, or corrupt. So the method is pretty straightforward. What you do is you want to prove that something is true, and so you just give example after example trying to support that claim. So how do you tell when you've got a good one, bad one, or ugly one? Well, here's the test. First, that's the back. There we go.
Oh. Wait, do you mind going back?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here's the structure for it. And again, in a good example, this would be in political ads, or some of this giving examples. Of course, you can also use it in everyday life. If your claim is that your roommate is never, is a slob, you can give an example of slobbery, all the slobbery things that they've done. Now, how do you tell if you had a good one, a bad one, or an ugly one? Well, since it's an argument by example, the more the better. So the more examples you can stack up. To give the example in politics, if someone claims to have lots of foreign policy experience, the more they have, the better. Secondly, of course, is a matter of relevance. So going back to the ancient days of 2016, people pointed out that Donald Trump, had no political experience, no foreign policy experience. And what people were arguing was, though, that he had business experience. And then critics pointed out saying, well, just because you're good at business doesn't mean you're good at president. For example, when I applied for jobs as a professor, I didn't say, I had experience running. I did a lot of running. They'd be like, what? You're not applying to that. I'm like, well, running's like being a professor because you're moving and stuff. You got to do things. And so the question would be, is it actually relevant? So if someone says, they have experience in business, and therefore they're qualified to be president, the question would be, well, is that actually relevant? Or someone claimed they had experience in foreign policy, and they claim that they travel to other countries. Well, I guess it's better than nothing, but the question would be, would having gone to France one time, one's junior year, would that be foreign policy experience? Also, the examples need to be specific and clearly identified. Otherwise, if someone just says, that thing. Lastly, just like with the argument by analogy, where you consider differences, you also have to consider what are called counterexamples. Are there things that don't fit? Now, a good question might be why would I bring up differences in the case of an argument by analogy, or counterexamples in the case of an argument by example? It'd be it'd be like in a boxing match saying someone, yeah, I have a really hard time guarding my left side, so you really want to punch the hell out of me on the left.
Right.
I wouldn't do that. Now, but when you're making an argument, there are actually good reasons to bring up the weak points. One is honesty, because the idea of philosophical argument is supposedly truth, so the idea is not to win by just persuasion, but you try to get some truth, so you'd say, honestly, here are some problems. Also, from a practical standpoint, bringing up and considering counterexamples from a pragmatic standpoint is useful, because you bring them up, and so an opponent who's thinking of them would say, oh, they've addressed this. And also part of the practical matter is this. Whenever there's a problem or crisis, one of the critical skills to managing problems is getting ahead of the problem. Namely, if you know it's going to come out, someone's going to know it, you're better off bringing it up yourself because you're in control, or at least a good chance of control on the narrative. So if you say, yes, I'm aware of these counterexamples, and you bring them up and address them, then you've handled them. Then if you're arguing against someone, they don't get to bring them up and you're new and let them kind of run wild. Also, of course, it makes your case look better because you've shown, aha, I consider arguments against my view, problems from my view, and I've addressed them, making my case stronger. Now, how would you use an argument by example, say philosophically? Well, here's an example. One of the paper options is to take Descartes' arguments that we'll look at and argue about whether Descartes got it right or not. And as we'll see in the future, one of his skeptical arguments is you can't trust your senses because they deceive you sometimes. And what he argues is an argument by example. And he gives examples of various optical illusions. Like if you have water and you put a straw in it, it seems bent. Or if you look at a square tower from the distance, it looks rounded. Or like modern ones, if you're looking down railroad tracks, they seem to meet. Or if you have a road with, a blacktop road, and it's hot, it seems like there's water on it. And then other optical illusions as well. And so what he argues is, by example, our senses deceive us, here are all these examples, therefore this is true. Now, if you want to agree with Descartes, one way to do it is come up with more examples as to why he's right about this. Or, if you disagree with him, you could counter with an argument by example. For example, you might say that although we are deceived by our senses, the obvious thing is we know we are deceived. We know these are deceptions because we've pierced these deceptions. For example, we know that the thing is not really bent because you can go and confirm that. We understand the science of optics. It causes that distortion. We can correct for that. That we know, again, with the science of optics, we know why it looks like they meet. We know why it looks like the towers are like that. And so we can analyze away all the optical illusions and problems. Therefore, we are not deceived by our senses because we can see right, literally see right through it. Therefore, Descartes is wrong. And that's how you can do a battle by example philosophically. Now again, you don't have to use these, you're not required to use these methods, but they're very useful ones. If you're writing a paper, arguing by analogy is always super useful. Whenever I'm like, gotta write something, what do? Analogy. Thank you, analogy. Or example. Before moving on, anything about arguing by example that needs more examples or stuff? Argument from authority. Now, the idea of an argument by authority is that a claim is true because an expert or authority has said it's true. Now, we use these in a couple ways. One way is just to directly prove something. We say it's true because this person says so. We can also use it as part of a larger argument. Like, this claim is true because this person says so, and that claim becomes a premise in a broader argument. Now, the reason why we use these, well, I guess I'll put it as a question. Today, can a person be an expert on everything? No, I mean, even in a single field, there's just so much stuff to know. Even way back, someone like Aristotle could claim to know like all of philosophy and science. But now, you could have a PhD in physics or biology and be very narrowly specialized. Especially like philosophy. Philosophy's been around since like 600 BC, so pretty old. And when people ask me, like, do you know this philosopher, that philosopher, I'm like, yeah, of course I've heard of them, but I've not read them. In fact, if I had started reading as soon as I could read and read every minute of my life, I still wouldn't be able to read all of philosophy. It's just, so they keep making more. It's like Doritos, cranking it out. Yeah, so we have to rely on people who are experts, even in our own field. So, for example, doctors, you go to a general practitioner, they'll refer people to specialists because they do medicine, but they don't do all medicine. So how do you build an argument by analogy? Well, they're pretty straightforward. Now again, when people write and speak normally, they don't talk like this. They would just say, this authority says it. And the assumption is, basically the implied argument is, this authority says it, their authority is true. So the structure would be, the person's an authority on the subject, they're talking in their subject, therefore it's true. And it's something we've all used. If you've done like a footnote in a paper, like a research paper, essentially an argument by authority. This is true because this expert says it's true. Now, how do you tell me you got a good one? Well, one kind of general problem with arguments from authority is even the best argument from authority is still not a super strong argument. Because what you're saying is, this is true because someone who probably knows what is true is saying it's true. But the reason why we use it is because in some cases it's the only game in town. So ideally you wouldn't use it because you just go directly to an argument for it itself. But again, as a practical matter, we kind of have to use it. So how do you tell we got a good argument from authority? Well, first, of course, the argument rests on the person's expertise. You're essentially saying, this person knows this stuff. They're saying this, they're probably right. So standard one is, the person is expert enough. And that can be like degree, experience and degree, and the qualifications will vary depending on the field. So if you're talking about something in academics, you look for like a PhD. If it's medicine, you look for like an MD. If it's something like wilderness survival, I guess you look for like living in the woods and not dying. Secondly, of course, one common misuse of this is when the appeal to authority is not based on the person's real area of expertise, but their real area of expertise is used sort of improperly. To illustrate, if the person's claim is not in their area, not in their lane, then there's no more reason to believe it than there would be for anyone else. Doesn't mean they're wrong, it's just that you can't refer to someone's expertise in one area to say therefore they're right about the claim outside their expertise. To illustrate, a good example of this is advertising. They'll have celebrities selling like cars or insurance or underwear or like sports drinks. But of course, if you have like an actor, like what is it, Matthew McConaughey, selling like cars, well, is his opinion on the quality of automobiles any better than anyone else's? No, he's an actor. Now, if he was like an automotive engineer, then sure, I mean, he would be qualified to say stuff. But if like an actor is talking about what car you should get or what insurance you should get or what beverage you should drink, they're relying on their fame as an actor, but of course that doesn't correspond to expertise in cars and sports drinks, etc. Similarly, when they ask actors and musicians and celebrities about political issues or moral issues, I mean, true, freedom of expression. People have the moral right to say stuff. But Angelina Jolie's opinion on the ethics of military spending, I mean, yeah, everyone is free to express their view. But that's not her deal. She's an actress. Now, someone could have multiple skill sets. For example, Peter Weller, the original RoboCop, he's a classics professor. So if he's talking about classics, yeah, it's not as an actor, it's as a person with a degree in classics. Or like Dolph Lundgren. He's got a master's in chemistry from MIT. So yeah, he can talk about chemistry because he's got a degree, even though he's it wouldn't be his acting skills, it would be the chemistry skills. Yeah, so people can have multiple areas of expertise, but they at least got to be the expert in that area. Final example, Stephen Hawking was talking about how AI is going to kill us all. Now, Stephen Hawking was a smart guy. He's like super dead now. But his field is physics. I mean, true, being smart means he can be smart about stuff, but that's not That's not his field. So the opinion of like a person who is an expert in AI, who may not be as famous as Stephen Hawking, is better than his opinion. Because they, similarly like when Elon Musk is talking about it, hey, he's a smart guy, but that's not his field. Not to mean he's wrong, it's just that people listen to him not because he's an expert in AI, but because he's Elon Musk, Tesla, and apparently smokes a lot of marijuana. Apparently. And does probably like other stuff. They shouldn't provoke him though, because he's like probably like 2 more provocations away from becoming a supervillain. He'd be like on his volcanic island, like the fools. I shall destroy them all with my killer Teslas. Thirdly, if you're dealing with like a professional field, one of the important sort of gold standards is agreement among experts. And here's why. If the experts disagree, and we're turning to experts because we don't know which expert to pick because we don't know. So if there's not agreement in the field, the rational thing to do is say, well, I don't know. So what if you're still going to do something? Well, in that case, you kind of go with, well, how much consensus is there? I mean, one good example of this is in, unfortunately, like with like nutrition. Because take the humble, egg. I'm not super old, but during my lifetime, eggs have gone from like, they're great for you, to, oh my God, it's like, you might as well just like eat cigarettes, to, yeah, they're okay, maybe like one a day, to, and so I think now they're back to like, yes, they're good for you, but not too many. And maybe next they'll find, oh my God, you're gonna die. Yeah, so one problem with food is, when like I go and research like what's gonna kill me, I'll get different opinions from different experts. So I really don't know, I mean, we do have a good idea like eating like just a bucket of sugar every day, clearly bad. But how much sugar is bad? Well, clearly a bucket, but is it, how much should you cut back? So one practical problem is that in areas like economics, nutrition, and psychology, we have so much disagreement. When you turn to the experts, you'll get, if you have 20 experts, you get 30 opinions. So in that case, a practical thing to do is suspend judgment and kind of try to go with, well, what is, what kind of evidence do we have? Now, if there's massive agreement among experts, then they're probably right, although they could be wrong. For example, smoking, pretty clearly bad, and the experts agree on that, and of course it does make sense. And you can, if you go by your own observations, you rarely see smokers winning marathons, for example. Although people used to smoke. If you look at old photos from like the Olympics back in the 1900s, people are like, smoking. Because that's what people did. Because they couldn't figure out that inhaling smoke would kill them. I think they would know. It's like when a house is on fire, you don't like run up and go like, ooh, this is gonna be fine. Now, a good example of this, of course, which is political, is climate change. My own view on climate change is probably real. Why? Because all the experts, 99% of the experts say it's real. I'm not a climate expert myself, although I did get an A in earth science. And so my view is, if I'm not an expert, I have to go with the majority of qualified experts. Could they be wrong? Yes. Are they more likely to be right than wrong? Yes. So probably climate change is probably real. Now, this of course can be qualified with the fact that yes, they could turn out to be wrong, but probably not. So someone would need like some reason to believe they're wrong. Fourth, the matter of bias. Now, one thing, sticking with climate change, one thing that people bring up as to why the experts agree so much, they claim is they're biased. That I've heard various reasons. One is they're all like leftists who hate capitalism. So they're really, I mean, for real. If you go and look at the climate change deniers, they advance the idea that they hate capitalism, they're trying to destroy it, so they're opposed to fossil fuel. Even though they say we're not against capitalism, we just do science. Another claim is, like in the case of Al Gore, is that they love capitalism, they're just trying to, they're lying to make money. That they're trying to sell us, movies and green tech, and they're just lying to make money. Now, if that could be proven that they were biased, that the climate change scientists were all socialist means together secretly to plot the destruction of capitalism, or that they were capitalists trying to make tons of money lying to us about green tech, then yeah, that would raise questions about their credibility. But if we don't have that evidence, which we don't, then their credibility remains intact. Now, in contrast, of course, those who claim there is not climate change, they're typically in the oil industry. And so it doesn't mean they're wrong, but the fact that the bias draws doubts about their credibility. Because if someone's being paid by, Chevron or Exxon, and they say, oh yeah, petroleum doesn't, fossil fuels don't cause this to happen, they could be right, but they have a reason to not be honest. So being biased doesn't prove someone is lying, but it gives you a reason to doubt their credibility. So when you're dealing with authorities, you always want to consider bias. But you want to make sure the bias is actually real and not make-believe. Next, there are many areas of expertise that are not really real. So there's a question of, are they actually experts in something legitimate, that's actually real? For example, if you go on the interwebs, there are people who claim to be, experts at, like, crystal healing, or various other things which are not, as far as science tells us, not a thing. Like, was it Gwyneth Paltrow? Isn't she the one that has, like, the site that sells all the stuff? And she got, I think it was her. I don't want to be unfair, it's not her, but there was some famous actress who was, like, selling all this stuff, and the FDA was like, you can't say that does that, because it doesn't do that. Rocks don't do that. And so there are some areas that are not real areas. Now, of course, people can raise the point that all areas started off like, in a way, kind of like in doubt. Then the question might be, maybe it will turn out to be like a real thing. But of course, until we have some reason to think that, say, crystal healing is real, then we would have reasons to be suspicious. I mean, it's not, you shouldn't just say they're wrong, but it's like, well, I don't know if that's a thing. So I really don't want to, like, buy that stuff. As a general rule, if someone's trying to sell you stuff, it might not be real. Lastly, the importance of citing the authority. Now, this has always been a problem, but especially a problem today, because often when you read, like, news stories, they'll say, like, instead of saying, like, McManus said this or Mueller said that, they'll say sources in the know of the Mueller investigation claim that. And the reason why that's a problem is because if you read an article that has an anonymous source, you're doing like a double argument from authority. You're saying the person writing this is an authority enough to judge the authority of the person making this claim, and they're an authority enough to be making a true claim. So it's super diluted. Now, this is not to say that anonymous sources should be just simply rejected and say, because there are good reasons to have anonymous sources. For example, the people leaking stuff in the Trump White House don't want to say who they are because they're going to get fired. So merely being anonymous doesn't mean it's wrong, but there are grounds for being suspicious, because you can't check. If they say an anonymous source in the White House says the White House is in chaos, seems plausible, but unless we know the source, we don't know, the person writing it could be making it up, or maybe they're being honest, but the person they're talking to is lying to them. We don't know. And so you need to know the authority. Now, in terms of how this is used philosophically, the main use would, of course, be to take, if you're arguing within the context of a theory. Now, one thing you can do in philosophy, which is totally legitimately philosophically, is some problems are like, well, a lot of problems are like super big. And so one thing that you run into is you're like, crap, how do I deal with this? There's like a million problems. What you can often do is, just to make it manageable, is operate within the context of a particular theory. And say, instead of saying, I'm gonna try to, well, take for example the problem of the external world. If you're just trying to prove like the world is really real for real, you have to build an entire theory of knowledge from the ground up, which would be like, you know, like Descartes' book, your Uranium book. But you haven't got time to write it. I have like this semester, or maybe you do. So what you could do, one way to address it is, in a sense, start with, you know, somebody else's view and say, I'm going to argue from the context of like Descartes or coherentism. And if we assume like this theory, how does it help us solve this problem? And then of course you want to pick a theory that has, you know, some credibility. Now we can also use it, of course, whenever you need to cite, well, authority. You need to like, you know, prove something, a claim you need for your paper, that you don't want to go and like argue up. So you can find, you know, philosophers that say that. Or for example, if you're doing like the thing about optical illusions, you could refer to experts on optical illusions and cite them. Now of course, arguments for authority as mentioned are weak, and they're especially weak in philosophy because if you just say this philosopher said this, there's another philosopher equally like respected who said the exact opposite. So, kind of, but still a very useful argument. Okay, so that takes care of the argument from authority. Before pressing on, anything about authority or respecting it, it needs more stuff. Now, a very useful argument, especially in weird stuff like epistemology and metaphysics, is the appeal to intuition. Now, if you have an intuition, what does that mean? Should you see a doctor?
Appeal to kind of like some of the beliefs you already know, so it's what you already kind of believe.
Yeah, it's kind of how you feel, you know, say gut feeling, how you kind of feel, believe, before you really got into the arguments. So when you appeal to someone's intuition, we're essentially trying to appeal to how they feel, what they already believe, and to kind of, it's like a mix of persuasion and argumentation. Because the persuasion part is, we're trying to make them feel a certain way, so that way they believe a certain way. Now, pure persuasion wouldn't be an argument. They should make them feel so they believe. But an appeal to intuition, involves kind of like that hybrid, where you're trying to make them feel, but also give them reasons, you know, kind of, the feeling kind of motivates them, and the reasons to try to prove it. To use an analogy, it's kind of like in the Mary Poppins song, you know, a spoonful of sugar makes medicine go down. That's a lot of sugar. I guess that's how diabetes happens. Yeah, so the idea is basically the sugar part is so people will, you know, accept it, and then the medicine part is the part that has the effect. Now the basic method is super weak, but it's super simple. And I cheat with this, you know, quite a bit, like when I'm blogging. You just say intuitively, comma, and just put in your thing, and then hope people accept that. Now you get away with that legitimately when it's an intuition you think most people have, or most people do. So when I say something like intuitively, you know, murdering nuns is bad, you're not going to get a lot of pushback on that typically. Or intuitively, being kind to children is good, most people go along with that. And so in many cases, you know, in the way you're saying intuitively, you're basically everyone already accepts this. Now, of course, the weak point is, if you're trying to argue for something that people aren't going to accept, saying intuitively, you know, comma, people are going to say, well, no, I haven't got that. You say like intuitively, you know, there is no problem in the external world, you'd be like, well, that doesn't quite do it. Now, so what's the improved method? Well, kind of the next step up is the story method. So what you do is, instead of just saying intuitively blah, 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 what you do is you tell a story. And the idea in the story is that you present a scenario to make the person reading through it think that what you're claiming is plausible. Because what it does is it appeals to their intuitions. And at reading through their story, they'll say, I see how this makes sense. For example, a good example of this was the arrival of the 1990 film, The Matrix. Because when I took epistemology before The Matrix, and you're trying to go like, problem of the external world, this could all be, you know, in your head. People are like, yeah, whatever. And then people see The Matrix and like, holy crap, it could all be all in my head. And so in a way, The Matrix is an appeal to intuition for the problem of the external world. Because you're like, you know, it's like Matrix. And then you're like, conclusion, problem of the external world, people are like, yeah, I can see how that, you know, it creates a plausible scenario in which everything you think is real is not real. And so telling a story, TV shows and movies that try to be philosophical, that's typically what they do. They'll take a philosophical scenario and instead of it being just sort of like dry, dull, you know, philosophy journal stuff, they turned it into an actual interesting, you know, story. And so people kind of, instead of reading the problem, you know, in a very dry, dull manner, they kind of feel the problem. Again, with epistemology, shows like, movies like The Matrix, shows like Black Mirror, Legion, and The Good Place, they explicitly take philosophy and put it into, you know, the actors and stories and effects. And so instead of it just, you know, being dull and boring in the journal, you see people acting out the problem. And so you, in seeing it presented well, creates, you know, appeals to our intuition. To give like another example in ethics, one of the classic sort of battles in ethics is between deontology, the idea that you follow the rules and don't break them, and utilitarianism, that you do, you know, basically the ends justify the means. So you can do anything as long as it has good consequences. And again, like written out in a you know, philosophical style journal article, it's, you know, pretty boring stuff. But if you see a movie like Avengers: The Infinity War, you see deontology versus utilitarianism in a way that's much more interesting. Because you have Doctor Strange basically utilitarian. You know, if you have to, if he's talking to Spider-Man and Iron Man, if you have to die to protect the gem, if it's a choice, I'm doing this because of the greater good. And Captain America, of course, his view is deontology. You do what is good no matter what. And so you see, like in intuitive, you know, through a story, you see this clash of intuitions. And then the movie sort of lets you make a judgment. Or, you know, should you be a deontologist that always do what you think is right regardless of the consequences, or do you do the calculations? And of course, since it's a movie, you know it works out. You know, it's, spoiler alert, they all come back because they already have movie contracts, so they gotta come back. Yeah, so Black Panther, he's okay. Well, no, he's dead now, but he'll be okay, because he's worth a ton of box office. Now, what's the, like, even more advanced method? Well, kind of the ideal version would be this. You tell a story, and then what you do after the story is you do the argument, where you show to the reader, argue to the reader, why this story proves their point. So, for example, here's a quick, concise example. So they say, like, the problem of the external world is clearly a problem. We have no way of telling what's real and not real. And then I describe, you know, say, like, The Matrix, or like Black Mirror per se. And then, of course, it just tells a story. What I could say is, this, of course, is just a fictional story. You can make it be whatever you want, but consider this. In the course of The Matrix, while you're in The Matrix, what would be a way to tell you're not in The Matrix? And the answer is, until something external comes in, like Morpheus, to tell him, there's no way of knowing, because it seems perfectly real. So, the world we're living in now could be just like that. Nothing is happening that indicates that we're not, you know, in the Matrix, and there's nothing happening that indicates that we are in the Matrix. So we simply do not know. And so that would be, you know, the story, then the argument as to how the story proves that point. Now, the appeal to intuition is good if you're good at storytelling, because the strength of the appeal is the story. So the better the story, the more people are motivated to to accept it, because it makes them, the story makes them feel, and also to envision it as plausible. And then when you get to the argument, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. That seems reasonable. It's also similar to how people who are good at motivating people in general. They're good at giving, say, like speeches or talks, and then they can get people to accept what they're going to say. And there's some people who are terrible at speaking. They get brilliant ideas, but they're just terrible at, people are just like, oh, I'm not going to do that. Then you have someone who's like really good at speaking, they get terrible ideas, and people are like, yeah, let's totally do that stupid thing. So the quality of appeal to intuition rests on basically how good the argument and story are. Now the way to counter appeal to intuition, of course, is if you want to argue against it, would be sort of like a counter intuition, or or you can tell a counter story against it. Like if you were doing the problem of the external world, the counter story would be that we somehow can tell the difference. Or you could make the argument that it doesn't matter. Like, for example, one kind of genre in anime is the idea that people are trapped in video games, completely trapped. So like if they die in a video game, they die for real. So effectively they know they're in a video game, but it's effectively real to them because they die, and they're trapped in it, so it's their life. They have to like live their life there. And so you could argue, like another story, you'd say, well, imagine you're playing like some MMO, and there's like that, however that works in the enemies, where somehow like your soul or spirit or whatever is pulled into the game. And now you're in a world, you know the world is fake, it's a virtual world, and so you know that. So what difference does this make? Well, you die here, you die for real, so that's no difference. If you just like don't eat, you die. If you just stand around doing nothing, you get bored or something kills you. And so even if you know that it's all fake, what matters is how you feel about it. And so you could argue by that appeal to intuition, if you were somehow trapped in something you knew was a video game, you would still keep playing normally as if it was real, because it wouldn't matter, because as far as you're concerned, it's effectively real, because you still get hurt and bored and tired and sick. And even though it's all fake, from your standpoint of your experience, it's just as real as real. Therefore, you could say the problem in the external world is really not a problem at all, because as long as like fire hurts and cold, and getting the flu sucks, whether you really have the flu or not, doesn't matter. You imagine you convince yourself like you're like throwing up over and over. I don't really have the flu; it's virtual flu. It wouldn't help you at all. You'd be like, yeah, it still sucks. So you could argue that even if this was a virtual world, it wouldn't, from a practice standpoint, it doesn't matter. It changes nothing. Unless you could escape, it changes nothing at all. So you can like counter story to the story. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the argument basics. And again, those are some useful argument templates, but you're not required to use them. So like, you don't have to have like argument by example, or argument by analogy, argument by intuition. Those are just some common useful tools. So if you're like, how do I do this? You can go and say, an analogy might work, or intuition might work, or an example, or maybe none of the above. Before heading into our content, and we'll begin kind of at the beginning, anything about that needs more stuff, or virtual reality. Now, we begin back in ancient Greece with our good dead friends, the sophists. And the reason why they're important here is because they're sort of the origin story of our good dead friend, Socrates, who is the origin story for our good dead friend, Plato. And it's kind of a Batman-like story, in a way. Well, not really. Well, there's a dad, so there we go. Now, back in this day, where Plato and Socrates were Socratizing Plato, this is, of course, the city-state of Athens, which is still there today. You can go and visit it. Maybe buy it, because Greece's economy is the dumpster. You might be able to buy it at a decent price. Now, Athens was, in a way, kind of the America of its time, or we're the Athens of our time. It was a golden age where Athens was at the top of its game. It was a major political, economic, social, scientific, political power at this time, with of course its main rival being the city-state of Sparta, which is another Greek city-state. Now a Greek city-state literally is what it sounds like. It was a city that was its own country. Now the Greeks recognized each other as Greeks culturally, same language, similar culture, but they did not consider themselves one nation. And they spent a lot of time fighting each other. I mean, the Athenians and the Spartans fought each other a lot. And the only time they really unify is when the Persians came to attack them, because they hated the Persians more than they hated each other, so they would fight the Persians together, and then go back to fighting each other some more. Kind of like Americans. Fight everybody else, and then we fight each other. Now, despite the fact that it was a golden age, it was also an age of irony. Namely that, despite like it being, Athens being the top of the game, etc., there was essentially unrest, there was distrust of authority, cultural malaise, etc. Again, just like us today. We're the dominant superpower in the world currently, but there's still all kinds of problems. That's always the case. So why were things the way they were? And how does this lead into Socrates and Plato? Well, first, there was a decline of traditional authority. Religion, etc., was declining. Athens was a democracy, and so the authority in a democracy is basically voting on the people. And so traditional authority is weakened. Just like in the United States, people decry that traditional values weaken. They've been claiming this forever, and it's always true. They've been declining since the beginning. Secondly, relativism was a major factor, and this will be one of the major foes of Plato. And the reasoning behind it was actually pretty good. How so? Well, during this time period, there was a great deal of intercultural exchange, travel, etc. And so people from Athens traveled around, the world, within the limits of the available technology, boats and walking and stuff. But they were very well, they were aware of, the Persians, the Egyptians, Africa, etc. And they would, go and speak with people from these different cultures. And people realized that cultures all did things differently. As Herodotus, the great historian, said, he has a story where the Emperor Darius of the Persian Empire, he asked a group of Greeks, how much gold can he pay them for them to consume the bodies of their dead? And they were horrified, because like all civilized people, they burn the bodies of their dead. Then he asked people of the Chalate tribe who consumed their dead, they're not cannibals, but as a ritual, they consume their dead, which is what Christianity does too. The Eucharist is, body of Christ, blood of Christ. And it's a religious thing. It's not like we're sitting around like chewing the relatives up. It's a respect thing. And he asked them how much he could pay them to burn their dead. And of course, that would be blasphemy. That would be terrible. And the conclusion was, people think is right wherever they are raised. So if you were brought to believe one thing, you think it's right. Or believe another thing, you think it's right too. And so people who traveled a lot realized every culture is different. There is no objective truth.
So is that why you can't really use like morals in a debate or in an argument rather?
Yeah, one reason, because if you believe relativism is true, everybody is right, but that means everybody is wrong. Yeah, so if there's no correct morality, then there's no way to argue morally, because all you're saying is, I think it's wrong. Be able to say back, I think it's right, and you're done. And the view was, well, if you're a relativist, that again, there is no correct or incorrect. People just do what they do. And as we'll see, Plato rejects that. Now, another causal factor was democracy and individualism. Now again, democracy, and it was in a very limited form in Athens, but it was more democracy than other places, which had zero. The idea, of course, is that you have, in this case, it was the male property owners, free will property owners could vote on stuff. And that, of course, changes the dynamic, because power is a matter of getting the votes. Individualism, of course, also changes things, because the focus is on the individual and individual success, typically. as opposed to like community. Now, this is basically, again, the United States, democratic within the limits of our democracy, and very individualistic. Now, also arising during this time period was skepticism. Why? Well, even back in these ancient days, people have been doing philosophy and science for centuries. And you had all these different thinkers. For example, Heraclitus said the world is fire. Others said it's air. Others said it's, Thales said it's water. Others said it's earth, air, wind, and fire. And other people said it's other stuff. And people noticed, hey, all these really smart people are saying all this stuff, they can't all be right, so we can't know anything. And so skepticism became a thing where you can't know. Now today, of course, we have sort of an extreme version of this, of relativism and skepticism, when you have people saying alternative facts and truth is not truth. And so we're living in the same essential thing. Now there's also an emphasis on the practical, because if life is going good, people focus on life here and now, which is why, like in the Middle Ages, when things were terrible, people were super religious. And now people are still kind of religious, but kind of not really, because people really focus on here and now. Because if they were super religious, they wouldn't be doing what they were doing, because everything they do is a path to hell, by their own standards, typically. Like lying. Lying, path to hell. There's nothing you could lie for here on earth that's worth it. People lie, and lie a lot. And they get to enjoy hell. No. I don't know, probably. Now, because of the democracy, etc., power lay with the masses. So what you would do is, just like today, the way you get power is you sway the masses. And the masses generally aren't swayed by, philosophical argument, you're swayed by emotion. And essentially, we're the new Athens. We're also the new Rome. And historians, 1,000 years from now, somebody will be teaching, probably in the same classroom, talking about, the age of America. Probably the same computer, too, because that's how education works. You get one computer forever. Really, that computer's been here since 2010. In computer years, it's ancient.
Right.
But it still works. Like me, ancient, but still mostly going. So what arose out of this city of Athens? Well, we have the sophists, and from the sophists arose our good dead friend Socrates, and then Plato. Now, the sophists arose in part because of the conditions in Athens, all that relativism, skepticism, etc. So, what's the deal for the sophists? What are they all about? Well, as we saw, skepticism arose because people looked at all these smart philosophers and scientists saying, it's fire, it's water, etc., and said, we can't know. All these smart people, they can't agree. We can't know. Also, again, because of the traveling around the world and encountering different cultures, they believed that truth was relative. There is no wrong or right. Now, if you believe we can't know, and you believe there's no wrong or right, there is, of course, still a problem. You still have 24 hours a day to fill up. So what do you do? And the sophist answer was this: success. Or in modern terms, win. That is, that what you should do is achieve success, because you can't know what's true, so there's really no point in trying to determine what's true, because there is none of that. And there's no good or bad, right or wrong, so there's no point in trying to do good, because there's none of that. And so their claim is, all that's left is success. Now again, we see this today. The sophists have never left. When someone gets on TV and talks about alternative facts, they're embracing, skepticism and relativism. When they reject, morality, they're embracing relativism. If people say all that matters is winning, they're embracing success. Yeah, the sophists never left. They're in charge today. Now, one thing, of course, comes up is, how far does your skepticism go? Like, if you said to a sophist, do you believe that fire burns and that jumping up a building would hurt? they say, most of them would say, well, yeah, because they do separate between what's called nomos and physis. Now, this is not a spelling error. It's like the English version of the Greek. So yeah, I got that clear. Physis, of course, is physics. And so this would be the physical sciences. And the sophists, for the most part, would say, yeah, the physical sciences are, real. That's not just relative. If you go to fire still burns, whether you're in Athens or Persia, but what they have their relativism skepticism about is nomos, which is the realm of norms, which is the realm of like ethics and values. And so their view is, yeah, they wouldn't typically doubt, the physical sciences, but all the, things about morality and so forth, it's all up for grabs. Although, as we'll see when we talk about the skeptics, there are some that doubt even this. Yeah, so basically what sophists did, in terms of like what their role was, is they would do this. They were paid teachers, and they would go to people or recruit people and say to them essentially, yeah, there's no truth, there's no morality, but if you pay me, I'll teach you how to sway the masses so you can achieve success. Now, so what did we do about like morality? Well, the sophists had two main schools of thought. One was this: there is no morality, no truth, but you should act like the masses want you to act. Because if you act in ways that go against their moral views or their religion, they're not going to like that. You're not going to get power. And so kind of the first advice is just go along with everyone else, so that way, talk about the gods, talk about, morality, but no, it's all not true. We just go along because otherwise they're not going to support you. The other school of thought they had was, yeah, that's all BS, so when no one's looking, just do whatever you want. Just don't get caught. Just, pretend to accept all this in public, but then, do everything you want to do, because again, there's no right or wrong, so why not? And just don't get caught doing this. Now, one of the most interesting things, of course, would be to, I guess, in a way, violate all the ethics and religion stuff and still succeed, which I guess can be done. So why were the sophists important? Well, from the standpoint of philosophy, which of course is biased, because from the standpoint of philosopher, the sophists are the bad guys. Of course, from their perspective, philosophers are the bad guys. Now, Socrates, he became Socrates in a way because of the sophists. He jokingly said that he took a course from a sophist, but he was too poor, so he couldn't afford to complete the course, and that's why he's bad at doing what he does. But Socrates took as we'll see, he took an intense disliking to the sophists because he believed that they were wrong. And if you wanted to be cynical, you could say that Plato was against the sophists because they were competition. Because during the time Plato was Platoing, the sophists would say to people, give us money, we'll teach you how to sway the masses, and then you'll get power, you'll get success. The poets said, we know all the truths, you give us money, we'll give you all the truths. And of course, the philosopher, Plato running his academy, said, you give us money, and we'll give you, morality, and we'll give you truth. And so if you want to be cynical, you could say that in a way, philosophy has been basically a battle of economics between philosophers who want people to pay them to philosophize against the sophists and the opponents. But philosophers don't make a lot of money, so we're clearly not in it for the money. So what did the sophists do in addition to the origin story of Socrates and Plato? Well, they contributed a lot to philosophy and science because they gave us skepticism, which ever since then people have had to address. They brought forth the notion of relativism, which becomes incorporated in philosophy and becomes something you have to, if you want to argue that there is good and bad, you've got to address. And of course, they developed things like rhetoric and grammar. You know, all those kind of communication skills, they developed those. So oratory and grammar and so forth comes out of the. That's not that other people didn't talk, but the Greeks really developed it into a science and spread it around the world, along with probably various diseases as well. But logic, the worst disease of all. Fortunately, people are very resistant to it. So, pretty important. And again, they're still around today, still doing stuff.
So would you say the sophists, where we get works like the 48 Laws of Power and like Machiavelli's The Prince, where it teaches you like very real common sense stuff, but to maneuver and set things up for your personal benefit?
Yeah, in general, it won't always fit, but in general, if you have someone who is taking the view, in a way there is not like objective truth, morality is not really a concern, but here's how you win, and all that matters is win, then yeah, you could see, make a pretty good case they probably are a sophist, because it's ironically a philosophical position that winning matters, and that's all that matters because there is no good or bad to say like good or bad winning, and there really is like no objective truth. Yeah, so books that focus heavily on success while rejecting ethics and truth, they would tend to be sophist works. But it's still, yeah, there's a lot of books like that. Yeah, good point. Now, of course, you can believe in success and not be a sophist, but generally that's kind of their deal. Can't know what's true, morality is relative, all that matters is success. Socrates. Socrates was born 470 BC, died in 399 BC, greatly hemlock, and is still, of course, dead today. He is put on trial as related by the dialogue, the Apology, and then in the Crito, we have his death scene where he drinks the hemlock. So why was Socrates put to death by the city of Athens? Well, the claim was, if you read the Apology, was that he was corrupting the youth, and he was believing in alien gods, and doing various other crimes. Not like larceny or murder, but things like investigating into the heavens above and the earth below, which seems like a weird crime. But the main one was corruption of the youth, and kind of the second one was basically religious crimes. Now, the experts who like Socrates think that he was really in trouble because of his view of wisdom. Now, philosophy, of course, literally means love of wisdom. And so people have been debating, what is wisdom? Now, back when Socrates was Socratizing, one of his friends went to the oracle at Delphi. And Delphi is still there today. You can see where the oracle was located. And the oracle endured for about 1,000 years. And what you would do is you would go to if you had a question, you'd go to the oracle and typically pay them and ask them a question. And they would have the oracle, she would channel like one of the gods and answer your question in a cryptic manner. The kind of thing you see in video games and movies. But supposedly they were always right. And again, they endured 1,000 years, so I guess they were doing something right. And one of the most famous prophecies was a Greek king, or a king went to the oracle and said, should I go to war? What would happen if I go to war? And the oracle said, if you go to war, a great nation will be destroyed. And of course, unfortunately, he hadn't taken the critical inquiry class and learned about ambiguity because a great nation would be destroyed. He thought it was the other side, but it was his. So prophet was right, but that's why you always need clarifications of who's going to get destroyed. So Socrates' friend goes to the oracle and says, Oracle, who is the wisest of all? And the oracle says, Socrates. Socrates is the wisest of them. So his friend runs back and says, guess what, Socrates? Guess who's the wisest of all? And Socrates says, who? You, Socrates. Me? How could it be me? Now Socrates, of course, doubts this. He thinks, I can't be the wisest of men because I'm not wise. So he sets out on a mission to disprove the gods. So he goes to the politicians, he goes to the poets, he goes to everybody, and tries to find someone wiser. And in doing so, he exposes them all for fools, in public, which causes them a lot of trouble. And the youth start imitating Socrates and questioning their authorities and their elders, and so this leads to trouble. Now Socrates, and we'll close with this, he concludes that since he doesn't know anything, and no one else knows stuff, and they think they know stuff, he concludes that wisdom is knowing you know nothing. That what little a person knows amounts to nothing. And this got him in trouble, and then he died. So we'll pick up next time with some more Socrates.